Right, so the largest refugee camp in the world is how the city of Rafah in southern Gaza is being described right now. Over 1 million people there, half the population of the Gaza Strip, huddled up in the last place the IDF and the Israeli authorities said was safe for them. Israel forced these people there. They told them it was for their own safety, and now they are all there. They're being targeted by military strikes ahead of a likely ground offensive with absolutely nowhere left to go. Last week, Israel began making advances on Rafah, targeting the tent city that has sprung up alongside the main city, swelling the size of the last refuge of the Gazan people. Last night, the carpet bombing began. A sleepless night, described as a night of hell in a place where people say you are suffering a slow death, either killed by the impending Israeli attacks or killed by the disease, lack of food, lack of humanitarian aid of any sort. And so this point was proven last night as 63 people were killed in the vicinity of the Kuwait Hospital in Rafah. Again, Israel targeting areas around hospitals, potentially the hospital itself in time, deliberately destroying the health system so disease becomes even more rife without solution, and the world just seems to keep on sitting and watching. Right, so last night was the most intense attack on Rafah we've seen to date, the last refuge of the people of Gaza as we know it is, and just to show how much Israel already knows they are despised around the world for what they are doing, breaking the ICJ ruling against them with impunity, they timed this attack whilst the people of their biggest backers, the US, their eyes were averted because they timed their attack on Rafah to coincide with the US Superbowl. 100 million Americans' eyes were glued to that, so weren't aware of what was happening in Gaza at the same time. They would have certainly found out later. What about their so-called leader, Genocide Joe, then? He posted this image. While airstrikes and carpet bombing were going on in Gaza, he posted this. It's nuts. On the other hand, perhaps I have it all wrong. He has bombed Yemen, Iraq, Iran and Syria this week. Perhaps this is the most honest image of himself he's ever posted. Anyway, self-glorification of himself aside, Biden has said an offensive against Rafah isn't credible without safe passage for civilians, and publicly and to Biden's face, Netanyahu has agreed with him. The problem is, there's literally no way of facilitating this. There's nowhere left for these people to go, and even if there were, why in God's name would they trust the IDF, Shin Bet, or anything Netanyahu says on the matter in order to deliver on that? Israel have literally blown up convoys of civilians on the way to where Israel have been sending them. They've sniped kids in the street. Rafah right now is being described as hell on earth, but the whole of the Gaza Strip has been described as a cemetery for children. The fact that half the population of Gaza is under 18 is never said often enough. This is a war on kids. So with this mild shift in Biden's narrative, he's still supplying arms, of course, is a split likely if Netanyahu invades Rafah on the ground too, with the scale of death and destruction given the concentration of people there now? I'll believe that when I see it. Netanyahu, for his part, has equated saying don't go into Rafah to losing the war, but a war is something conducted by two sides against each other. This is one of the best armed, least moral armies in the world, fighting kids mostly. It's a massacre and always has been. 70% of the people killed have been women and children for a reason. Even more perversely perhaps is the fact Netanyahu, after ditching a ceasefire plan that would have seen all Gaza hostages freed, a 4-month ceasefire, is still using the hostages held by Hamas as an excuse to continue his assault, despite the fact they would have been freed. Apparently enough of them are still alive to warrant continuing with the assault, he said. But when asked how many were left alive, all he'd say was, enough. In other words, he doesn't know. The only reason he spurned that ceasefire is because he can't politically afford to end this conflict. I've said it will continue, no matter where Palestinians go. He'll claim Hamas are hiding amongst them still, and use that as an eternal excuse to persecute them down to the last man. Israel have, of course, as we know, killed some of their own hostages given their indiscriminate actions. There's been a lot made today over the fact 2 Israeli hostages have actually been rescued. I know, hold the bus, Israel have actually saved some of their own people. But that means their military offensive has now rescued a grand total of 3 hostages since October 7th, and the first rescue since October itself. How come, after all this time, they've been so bad at rescuing their own people? Was that not the whole purpose of going into Gaza? To my mind, it shows they haven't actually been trying, and of course that wasn't their real reason for going into Gaza. When this is a government with such a thing as a Hannibal directive in existence, you can't say that this is a regime that puts value on life. In fact, it values the lives of Palestinian hostages in its jails and keeping them there more than the lives of their own people. The whole point of the Hannibal Directive is to kill their own people before they're taken hostage, and therefore Israel put in the position where they have to do hostage exchanges. The big caveat I would put on this is that none of the mainstream media are actually doing is that this claim of 2 rescued hostages has come from Israel. So are they really rescued hostages then, or just another setup? Because really, why are you taking Israel's word for anything at this point? Another possibility was spelt out by US news outlet Axios, came via their political analyst Barak Ravid, who tweeted out, "The IDF and Shin Bet have been working on the rescue operation for several weeks based on intelligence. The operational opportunity came today. The Israeli Air Force conducted heavy airstrikes in Rafah as a diversion to allow the extraction of the 2 hostages." Well, that implies the 63 people killed in Rafah through airstrikes last night died, so Israel could rescue 2 hostages. That is psychotic. The Kuwait Hospital, like all hospitals through Gaza that have stood and fallen, is getting overwhelmed too, as one of the few hospitals still standing. It is already struggling with patients sick or malnourished, and now more and more caught up in military strikes are going in. Aid is struggling to get in. It's nowhere near enough anymore with the number of people now concentrated in Rafah. Roughly 1 truck an hour is getting through the Rafah crossing. And it's also struggling to get through via Israel and its border crossings with Egypt, as Zionist settlers are now setting up tents themselves with the intention of remaining at those crossings to stop aid intended for Gaza from getting through. They've been so successful at this that Israel have closed 1 crossing because of them at Kerem Shalom, and a planned visit by US Secretary of State Antony Blinken to oversee aid deliveries was cancelled, again because the aid can't get through. And instead of arresting these sick individuals, Israel's just shrugging its shoulders at the lack of aid getting in. The Biden administration just keeps wringing its hands instead of doing something as well, just sitting and watching and letting it happen, just as so many other Western nations are doing. Complicity for as long as they provide any kind of aid or assistance to Israel whilst they are doing this. None of it in our names. Back to this matter of safe passage, though. Assuming Israel do provide some, somehow. What safe passage and to where? Repeatedly, the IDF and other Israeli security forces have stopped the people of Gaza returning north as they have cleared those areas and forced people south, shooting people that have attempted to do that. But now, of course, they are as far south as they can go. There's no way they'll allow people north again in case Hamas persists. That's what they'll say. Of course it's what they'll say. So there's only one real direction they can be pushed, but it would risk a political fallout with Egypt if they did it. Israel wants control of the Rafah border crossing, and if they get it, who's to say they won't just open it, and in the name of survival, of course the Gazan people will pour into Egypt. There's literally nowhere else, no other option. If they can't control it, who put it past Israel to blow a big hole in the crossing so that people can flee through that instead? Egypt have already been reinforcing the crossing, fearing this could happen, but it wouldn't stand up to an Israeli military attack. Of course, even this depends on Israel being taken at its word and providing safe passage at all, and even if they did that, they'd probably just blame Hamas for it instead, though I don't want to contemplate where that train of thought particularly takes me. Unless there is a concerted effort to stop Israel entering Rafah right now, it's going to happen. And still, even now, nothing is done. We just watch. A completely reasonable ceasefire offer was put on the table before Netanyahu, and he turned it down. Details of that and his motives for doing so can be found on this video recommendation right here. Well worth a watch if I say so myself. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.